The phone felt like a loaded weapon in her palm. She stood in the shadowed corner of his study, the blue glow illuminating her face as she stared at the image that had just arrived from an unknown number. A photograph, high resolution and unmistakable. Her husband's tattooed hands. Those same hands that had traced her spine this morning, that had promised her forever 4 years ago, resting possessively over another woman's pregnant belly. 5 months along, maybe more. The stranger's face tilted up toward him, glowing with the kind of contentment that felt like a knife twisting between ribs. The woman's dress clung deliberately to her curves, showcasing what she carried, what she'd stolen, what she now wore like a crown. Her breath came shallow and cold. The sound of the front door opening 2 floors below echoed through the marble halls like a countdown. He was home. She had minutes, maybe seconds, to decide who she would be when he walked through that door. The grieving wife who would beg for explanations? Or the woman who would burn his kingdom to ash and dance in the smoke? What she chose next would destroy one of them forever. Her fingers tightened around the phone until her knuckles went white. The image seared itself into her memory. His bare chest, the intimate angle, the way his hand curved protectively over the swell of life he'd created with someone else. The same life she'd prayed for, bled for, endured 4 years of empty arms and shattered hope to give him. His footsteps resonated against Italian marble, moving closer. That confident stride of a man who believed himself untouchable, a king surveying his empire. His voice carried up from the foyer, smooth and warm, the voice that once made her pulse race. "Lucinda? Are you home?" Another lie wrapped in honey. "Hey there. Welcome to Empire Stories. We're building a community that refuses to accept neglect and betrayal as normal. If you believe women deserve respect, loyalty, and real love, not control disguised as protection, subscribe and help us get to 1,000 subscribers. Your support helps us spread these stories to people who need to know. They deserve better, and it's okay to walk away." She had spent 4 years becoming the perfect queen to Chicago's most dangerous king. Through every blood-soaked negotiation in smoke-filled back rooms, every calculated smile at charity galas where donations masked money laundering, every night she stood beside him while he built an empire on the bones of his enemies. She had played her role flawlessly, the dutiful wife, the strategic partner, the woman who knew where everybody was buried because she'd helped dig half the graves. Their penthouse loomed above the Chicago skyline like a fortress, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a vista of a city that bent to the Blackwood name. Everything gleamed with obscene wealth, hand-carved molding from Europe, art worth more than entire neighborhoods, furniture that whispered power in every line and curve, a kingdom built on fear and respect. But tonight, as she'd been arranging white orchids in a crystal vase, trying to fill the emptiness that had been growing in her chest for months, that wrongness she'd been ignoring finally crystallized into truth. The signs had been there. She'd been too proud to see them, too confident in what they'd built together. His late-night disappearances, business trips that stretched longer than necessary, the way his eyes slid past hers when he explained away another absence. "The Riverside deal is more complicated than anticipated," he'd say, his voice flat, rehearsed. "These things take time. You understand." She understood the machinery of organized crime better than most. She'd been raised in it, the daughter of old guard syndicate royalty who'd handed him his first territory, who'd made him legitimate in the eyes of the families that mattered. She spoke the language of power fluently. She knew how wars were won with whispers and wire transfers as much as bullets. What she couldn't decipher was why every word from his mouth lately tasted like betrayal. The elevator chimed. She set down her phone, screen dark now, and turned toward the sound. Her reflection caught in the antique mirror. A woman in black silk, dark hair swept back, eyes that had watched men die and never flinched. Even now, even knowing what she knew, her body betrayed her with that old anticipation. The memory of what they'd been before everything rotted from the inside. He appeared in the doorway, and she understood again why he was dangerous. Tall, ink crawling up his neck and disappearing beneath his collar, a jaw that looked carved by something violent and divine, eyes that could promise salvation or damnation depending on his mood. He moved like a predator who'd never known fear, custom suit perfectly tailored, every inch of him screaming power and control. He crossed the room and pulled her against him with bruising force. His mouth found hers, hungry and possessive, the kiss of a man who believed he still owned her. "I've been thinking about you all day," he murmured against her throat, his hands sliding into her hair, holding her in place. "Felt like forever being away from you." She let him kiss her, let his hands roam, let him believe, for these final moments, that nothing had changed. "You were gone since morning," she said softly, her voice steady as stone. "Too long." His thumb traced her jawline, those tattooed fingers that had been photographed on another woman's skin. "You're the only thing that makes sense in this world." This version of him, attentive, devoted, singularly focused as if she were his entire universe, would have destroyed her with relief a week ago. Now it just felt like another performance, another lie in a marriage built on an empire of them. She smiled up at him, cold and perfect, because she'd already made her choice, and he had no idea that the queen he'd betrayed had just declared war. She wasn't born into softness. She was forged in blood and boardrooms, raised in the kind of silence that comes before violence. Her father, Richard Castellane, had ruled the South Side with an iron fist wrapped in Italian leather gloves. Old money, old power, the kind of legacy that didn't need to announce itself because everyone already knew to bow. The Castellane name opened doors that stayed locked for everyone else. Her childhood had been private tutors and deportment lessons, learning to smile through 7-course dinners, while men discussed territory disputes over cigars and brandy. She'd watched her father negotiate treaties with a handshake and end rebellions with a phone call. By the time she turned 16, she understood that power wasn't about who shouted loudest. It was about who controlled the room without saying a word. He'd been nobody when they first met. Just another hungry kid from the West Side with tattoos crawling up his arms and rage burning behind his eyes. Ambitious, reckless, dangerous in all the ways that made weak men nervous and smart men take notice. Her father had seen something in him, that raw, unpolished brutality that could be weaponized if properly directed. "Give him the Riverside territory," she'd overheard her father tell his consigliere one night. "Let's see if he bleeds or builds." He'd built, viciously, methodically. Within 2 years, he'd turned Riverside from a crumbling disaster into the most profitable district in the syndicate. He'd crushed competitors, absorbed their operations, and done it all with a smile that never reached his eyes. Her father had been impressed. More than that, he'd been convinced he'd found his successor. The marriage had been strategic, a merger of old power and new hunger. Her father's empire needed fresh blood, someone willing to get their hands dirty in ways the old guard couldn't anymore. And he needed legitimacy, the kind of respectability that only came with the Castellane name attached to his. She'd agreed because she'd seen something too. Not love. Love was for people who had the luxury of weakness. But partnership, potential. A man who matched her ambition with his own, who understood that empires were not maintained with sentiment but with calculated ruthlessness. They'd built something extraordinary together. Expanded territories, consolidated power, laundered millions through legitimate businesses that bore her family's seal of approval. She'd been his strategist, his diplomat, his bridge to the families that mattered. Without her, he was just another thug with a gun. With her, he became untouchable. Her father had died 3 years into their marriage. Heart attack, they'd said publicly. She knew better. The stress of watching his daughter give everything to a man who was already learning how to take without giving back. Now, standing in this penthouse paid for with her family's initial investment, staring at proof of his betrayal, she finally understood what her father had seen at the end. The mistake they'd both made. They'd given a starving man a seat at the table and expected gratitude. Instead, he'd decided he deserved the whole feast. Drop a comment below. Do you think she saw the betrayal coming? Or was she blindsided? Let us know your thoughts. She opened her phone again, studied the image with surgical precision. The woman's face was younger, softer, unmarked by the years of calculated survival that had sharpened her own features. But it was the expression that destroyed her. The absolute certainty in that smile. The way she looked at him like he'd promised her the world. The same way she'd once looked at him, before she learned that promises from men like him came with expiration dates. Her finger hovered over the contact labeled Graves, her father's oldest friend. The man who controlled the syndicate council's votes. The man who could unmake kings as easily as crown them. She pressed the dial. But before it could ring, she heard his footsteps on the stairs. Coming closer. Coming to kiss her with lips that had whispered promises to another woman. Coming to hold her with hands that had cradled a future he'd stolen from their marriage. She ended the call, slipped the phone into her pocket, turned toward the doorway with a smile that would have made her father proud. Because the thing about being raised in this world, you learned patience. You learned that revenge served cold lasted longer. You learned that the most devastating wars weren't fought with guns but with strategy, precision, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for the final checkmate. He thought he'd chosen carefully, thought he'd hidden his tracks, thought he understood the game. He had no idea she'd been playing it longer, better, and with far more at stake than his fragile ego could comprehend. Subscribe to see exactly how the daughter of Chicago's most ruthless syndicate boss dismantles the man who forgot where his power actually came from. The real game was about to begin, and this time she was playing for keeps. The Greystone Foundation Gala was the kind of event where Chicago's elite came to launder their reputations through charity. Crystal chandeliers, champagne that cost more per bottle than most people's rent, and enough diamonds in the room to fund a small nation. She'd attended 100 of these, smile fixed, hand resting on his arm, playing the role of devoted wife while deals were struck in shadowed corners. Tonight felt different. She could taste it in the air, metallic and sharp like blood before it spilled. He'd been tense all evening, his jaw tight, eyes scanning the crowd with the hypervigilance of a man expecting an ambush. She'd watched him check his phone 3 times in the last hour. Each time, his shoulders had relaxed slightly. Each time, she'd catalogued it as evidence. "You seem distracted," she murmured, adjusting his tie with practiced intimacy, the gesture of a woman who still believed she owned him. "Big week," he said, the lie smooth as aged whiskey. "The Riverside expansion is hitting some complications." She nodded, let him believe she'd accepted it, then turned her attention back to the ballroom. That's when she saw her. The woman from the photograph stood near the bar, and she'd dressed for war. A champagne-colored dress that clung to every curve, the fabric deliberately tight across her midsection, showcasing what she carried like a trophy. 5 months pregnant and glowing with the kind of confidence that came from believing you'd already won. Her dark hair fell in waves over bare shoulders, and she wore a diamond necklace that caught the light with every movement. Who do you think bought her those diamonds? Drop your guess in the comments. She was younger than expected. Mid-20s, maybe. Beautiful in that fresh, unmarked way that hadn't been tested by years of survival in this world. The kind of beauty that made stupid men think they could start over, rewrite their history, pretend the bodies they'd buried didn't still need tending. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. The woman smiled, not the nervous smile of someone caught, the deliberate, razor-sharp smile of someone who wanted to be seen, who'd come here specifically to stake her claim. She watched her husband's entire body go rigid, watched him mouth something that looked like, "What are you doing here?" Watched the woman tilt her head and touch her belly with one hand, proprietary and possessive. The message was clear. "I'm carrying the future." "What are you carrying?" "Just the weight of a name that's not even yours." She felt something cold and crystalline form in her chest. Not rage. Rage was hot, messy, uncontrolled. This was calculation. This was the moment every strategist waits for. The moment your opponent makes the fatal mistake of believing they've already won. He moved toward the woman with the barely concealed panic of a man trying to contain a wildfire. She let him go, watched him intercept her near the bar, his hand closing around her elbow, his mouth close to her ear.
Urgent.
Furious, the woman laughed, loud enough to turn heads, then let him steer her toward the terrace doors. She counted to 30, lifted a glass of champagne from a passing server, followed them into the night. The terrace overlooked the city, lights glittering like scattered diamonds across the darkness. They stood in the shadows, his back to the door, the woman facing him with her arms crossed over her rounded belly. "You promised me you'd tell her this week," the woman was saying, voice sharp with accusation. "You promised me we'd stop hiding. The timing isn't right. You need to be patient." "Patient? I've been patient for 8 months. I'm showing now. People are going to figure it out. Your child deserves better than being a secret." She stepped out of the shadows then, champagne glass steady in her hand, smile perfectly composed. "Don't stop on my account," she said, voice cutting through the night like a blade. "I'm absolutely fascinated to hear more about what my husband's child deserves." His face went pale. The woman's smile widened, and she realized with perfect, terrible clarity that this confrontation was exactly what the mistress had orchestrated. This wasn't an accident. This was an ambush. The woman extended her hand, diamond bracelet catching the light. She recognized it instantly. Anniversary gift. Last year. The one she'd helped him pick out. "I'm Harper Quinn," the woman said, her voice honey-sweet poison. "And I think it's time we had a conversation about the future of the Blackwood legacy." The champagne glass shattered against marble, golden liquid spreading like blood across white stone. Subscribe now, because what happens next will redefine everything you thought you knew about revenge. She'd left the gala before the main course was served. Let him explain her absence however he wanted. Let him scramble to contain the damage his pregnant mistress had deliberately detonated in the middle of Chicago's most exclusive charity event. She had more important things to do than watch him perform damage control. The Drake acquisition had been his obsession for 6 months. A waterfront development deal worth $40 million. Prime real estate that would cement the Blackwood influence over the entire northern corridor. He'd spent countless nights locked in his office, phone calls stretching past midnight, explanations that came too quickly about permits and zoning complications and investor negotiations. She'd believed him because she'd wanted to, because believing meant their partnership still mattered, because the alternative was admitting she'd been playing chess while he'd been playing house. His financial records had been laughably easy to access. He'd never changed the passwords to their shared accounts. Never imagined she'd go looking. Why would she? She was the devoted wife, the strategic partner, the woman who'd given him everything. The transaction history told a different story. Drake Acquisition LLC. Monthly transfers. 200,000. Then 300. Then $500,000 in a single wire labeled "Property Closing Lincoln Park." Lincoln Park. Old money neighborhood. Tree-lined streets. The kind of place where young families pushed expensive strollers and pretended the world wasn't built on blood and broken promises. She drove there in the dark, her car sliding through streets slick with October rain. Found the address easily. A renovated brownstone, lights glowing warm against the night. Cream-colored curtains. Window boxes with flowers that hadn't died yet. A brass door knocker polished to perfection. Through the bay window she could see inside. Pale yellow walls. A rocking chair positioned near the fireplace. Shopping bags from designer baby boutiques scattered across hardwood floors. And there, mounted above a white crib, a mobile of silver stars that caught the lamplight and threw dancing shadows across pristine walls. A nursery, complete, waiting, built with money that should have expanded their empire, instead funding his fantasy of a fresh start with a woman young enough to believe his lies were promises. What would you do if you found your husband's secret second life? Tell us in the comments. She took photographs. Every angle, every detail. The stuffed animals arranged on shelves. The changing table stocked with supplies. The name spelled out in wooden letters above the crib. James. James. He'd chosen a name, made it real, committed to a future that erased her from the narrative entirely. Her phone buzzed. A text from him. "Where are you? We need to talk about tonight." She stared at the message, then at the nursery, then at the financial transfers still open on her tablet screen. 40 million meant for empire building, redirected into playing father to another woman's child. Her father had taught her that the worst betrayals weren't crimes of passion. They were calculated thefts disguised as love. The kind where a man took everything you'd built together and handed it to someone else, then expected you to smile through the robbery. She texted back, "Home soon. Just handling some business." One more photograph. Wide angle. The whole room captured in perfect detail. Then she forwarded it to herself from 3 different devices, uploaded it to encrypted cloud storage, and sent a copy to her attorney with a timestamp and location tag. Evidence. Ammunition. The beginning of the end. Because here's what he'd forgotten. She didn't just know where the bodies were buried. She knew which graves were shallow enough to dig up when the time came. Hit subscribe if you want to see how she turns his betrayal into his complete destruction. The thing about building an empire with someone is that you know exactly where all the cracks are. Every weak point, every hidden asset, every account that existed in the shadows between legal and laundered. She'd helped design the architecture. Now she'd dismantle it brick by brick while he slept beside her, none the wiser. 3 days after discovering the nursery, she sat in her home office with the door locked, laptop screen casting blue light across her face at 2 in the morning. The Blackwood financial network spread before her like a spider's web. Shell corporations, offshore holdings, real estate portfolios buried under LLC names that meant nothing to auditors but everything to people who understood how power was really stored. Her father had taught her young. Never put your name on anything you might need to burn later. Always have an exit strategy. Always keep leverage. She'd been the one to set up the Cayman accounts. The one who'd structured the Montenegro holdings. The one who'd created the paper trail that made 40 million in revenue look like 12 million to the IRS while the rest disappeared into investments that couldn't be traced, seized, or divided in court. He'd signed everything she'd put in front of him. Trusted her completely. Never bothered to read the fine print that gave her unilateral access to accounts he'd forgotten existed. First, the liquid assets. She transferred 2 million from their primary holdings into an account established in her maiden name. Castellane Capital Management. Legitimate, clean, untouchable. The kind of money that would fund a very comfortable divorce and an even more comfortable revenge. Then the properties. The Miami condo purchased through a Delaware LLC. She reassigned ownership to a trust she'd established 3 years ago. The Vegas nightclub that generated $500,000 annually in clean profit. She transferred operating control to a corporation where she held the deciding votes. The warehouse district investments that he thought were his crowning achievement. She quietly adjusted the shareholder agreements, backdated the paperwork, and secured herself as primary stakeholder. If you were in her position, would you take everything or leave him with something? Let us know below. Every transaction was legal. Every signature was hers to use. Every document had been prepared years ago by attorneys who owed their careers to her family name, not his borrowed reputation. She worked methodically, precisely, the way surgeons remove tumors, cutting away everything diseased while leaving just enough behind that the body wouldn't realize it was dying until too late. By dawn, she'd moved $18 million, reassigned 4 properties, secured controlling interest in 6 businesses. He still had his name on things. He still had his title. He still had the penthouse and the cars and the appearance of power. but the foundation beneath him had turned to sand. One strong wind and everything would collapse. She heard him stirring in the bedroom, shower running, his morning routine beginning. In an hour, he'd kiss her goodbye, tell her he had meetings all day, probably spend his afternoon at the Lincoln Park townhouse playing house with his pregnant mistress and their son-to-be. She closed her laptop, made herself coffee, put on the face of the devoted wife one more time. Because the most important part of any heist isn't the theft. It's making sure the mark doesn't realize they've been robbed until you're already gone and the exits are sealed behind you. He walked into the kitchen, pressed a kiss to her temple, grabbed his keys. "Love you," he said, the words automatic and empty. She smiled. "I know." The door closed behind him. She pulled up the final account on her phone. The emergency fund. The nuclear option. 22 million in untraceable cryptocurrency her father had converted before he died. Stored in a cold wallet only she could access. The war chest was ready. Now she just needed to choose the perfect moment to declare war. She chose Friday night. He'd be relaxed, off guard. A glass of scotch in his hand and his defenses down after a week of successfully juggling 2 lives. She waited until he settled into his leather chair in the study, the room where he'd built his kingdom on her family's foundation. She walked in carrying her phone. "No preamble. No tears. No teatrix. We need to talk," she said, her voice level as flat water. He looked up, that easy smile already forming. "Can it wait? I've got the Riverside reports to review." She placed the phone face up on his desk. The image filled the screen, his tattooed hands cradling another woman's pregnant belly. The intimacy of the angle, the unmistakable evidence of betrayal captured in high resolution. The color drained from his face. His scotch glass froze halfway to his lips. "Before you insult my intelligence with denials," she continued, still standing, still composed, "I've seen the Lincoln Park townhouse. I've seen the nursery. I know about James. I know the Drake acquisition money funded your fantasy of playing father to someone else's, correction, your child." He set the glass down carefully. "Let me explain. I don't want explanations. I want a decision." She glanced at her watch, a vintage Cartier her father had given her on her wedding day. "You have 1 hour. The girl and the baby or the empire. You can't have both. That's not fair." Fair. The word came out sharp as a blade. "You spent 40 million of our money building a life with another woman, and you want to lecture me about fair?" He stood, tried to close the distance between them. She held up one hand, stopping him cold. "Here's what happens if you choose her," she said, her voice dropping to something colder than Chicago winter. "I file for divorce. I take half of everything in the settlement. The syndicate council learns you've been compromising operational security for a mistress. Your reputation as a serious player? Gone. The families that respect you because you married me? They'll remember you're just a West Side kid who got lucky." His jaw clenched. She could see him calculating, weighing options, trying to find an angle. "But if you choose the empire," she continued, "if you choose this marriage, you cut her off completely. No contact. No secret visits. No child support that can be traced back to you. She disappears from your life like she never existed. You get to keep your throne, your reputation, your power. What do you think he'll choose? Power or the woman carrying his child? Comment your prediction." "You can't ask me to abandon my own child." "I'm not asking." Her eyes met his, and for the first time in their marriage, he saw something in them that made him understand what it meant to be truly afraid. "I'm giving you a choice. The same choice you've been forcing me to live with every day you've been building that nursery." She checked her watch again. 58 minutes left. "I suggest you think very carefully about which life you want to keep. Because the moment you choose, the other one burns to ash." She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the frame. "Oh, and one more thing," she added, not looking back. "If you choose her, I'll make sure Harper Quinn learns every single detail about how you've been lying to her too. The offshore accounts you kept secret. The business you conduct that would make her suburban dreams shatter. The bodies buried in foundations of buildings with your name on them. Let's see how much she loves you when she realizes what you really are. The door clicked shut behind her. She stood in the hallway, her hands steady, her breathing controlled, while her husband sat alone with the choice that would define the rest of his life. She already knew what he'd choose. Men like him always chose power over love, chose empire over heart, chose the throne over the truth. And that choice would be his greatest mistake. 43 minutes. That's how long it took him to choose. She'd given him an hour, but he didn't need it. She heard his footsteps in the hallway, measured and deliberate. The walk of a man who'd made his calculation and convinced himself it was the right one. He found her in the sitting room, glass of wine in hand, staring out at the city lights that stretched endlessly below their penthouse kingdom. "I choose us," he said. The words came out steady, rehearsed. "I choose this marriage, the empire, everything we've built together." She didn't turn around, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her face. "And the girl, I'll handle it." His voice dropped lower, the tone he used when discussing problems that needed to disappear. Cleanly, quietly. "She'll be taken care of." Taken care of. The phrase men like him used when they meant erased. Relocated. Paid off and silenced like every other inconvenient truth they'd buried over the years. "I want details," she said, finally turning to face him. "I want to know exactly how you plan to make your pregnant mistress and your unborn child vanish from our lives." He moved to the bar, poured himself 3 fingers of scotch. Drank half before answering. "I've already made calls. My people will go to Lincoln Park tomorrow morning. They'll offer her $2 million, a house in Portland, and a new identity if she needs it. Far enough away that there's no risk of her coming back. No risk of the child ever being connected to the Blackwood name. 2 million. She let the number hang in the air. That's generous for a mistake. It's enough to ensure she stays silent. He drained the rest of his scotch. She'll take it. She's smart enough to know that fighting me would be a war she can't win. She watched him, studied the way he'd already detached, already reduced the woman he'd whispered promises to, the child he'd named James, to nothing more than a transaction requiring cleanup. This was the man she'd married. The man who could compartmentalize love and survival into neat columns on a balance sheet. "What did you tell her?" she asked. "When you called to arrange this? What words did you use to explain why you're abandoning your son?" Something flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe, or just annoyance at being questioned. "I told her the truth, that I made a mistake, that my life is here with you, and she needs to move on." "How noble." She set down her wine glass. "And if she refuses?" His eyes went cold. "She won't refuse." The threat was clear. Men like him had ways of making problems disappear that didn't involve money or relocation. She'd seen it before. Watched him orchestrate the quiet erasure of people who'd become inconvenient to the empire. She wondered if Harper Quinn understood yet what kind of man she'd chosen to love. If she'd figured out that the tattooed hands that had cradled her belly could just as easily wrap around her throat if she became an obstacle instead of an amusement. "I want proof," she said. "When it's done. I want confirmation that she's gone and she's not coming back." He crossed the room, pulled her against him with the same possessive force he'd always used. "You have my word." His word. The same word he'd given Harper when he'd promised her a future. The same word he'd given her on their wedding day. Words were currency he spent freely and honored rarely. She let him hold her. Let him believe his choice had saved them. Let him think that by choosing the empire he'd chosen correctly. But standing in his arms, feeling his heartbeat against her chest, she was already counting down to the moment she'd reveal the truth. That there was no us to choose anymore. That the empire he thought he'd saved had already been seized from within. That by picking her, he hadn't chosen his salvation. He'd chosen his executioner. The confirmation came 3 days later. A text from his head of security, brief and clinical. Portland. Settled. No complications. Harper Quinn had taken the money and disappeared. $2 million and a one-way ticket away from the life she thought she was building. Away from the man who'd promised her everything and delivered abandonment. Away from Chicago and the Blackwood Empire that had no room for inconvenient children and mistresses who'd overplayed their hand. He'd shown her the message like it was proof of his devotion. Like erasing his pregnant girlfriend was a romantic gesture meant to win her back. She'd read it without expression. "Good," she'd said. "Now we can move forward." Except they didn't move forward. They moved into something that looked like marriage but felt like a mausoleum. She stopped touching him first. No more hand on his arm at events. No more fingers threading through his hair when he was stressed. No more casual intimacy that had once defined them. When he reached for her in bed, she turned away, spine rigid, the space between them expanding into an uncrossable gulf. "You're still angry," he said one night, his voice rough with frustration and something that might have been fear. "I'm not angry." She kept her eyes on the book she was reading, didn't look at him. "Anger implies I still care enough to feel something." He tried everything. Flowers that she left to die in their vases. Jewelry that stayed in boxes unopened. Dinner reservations at restaurants where they used to celebrate, canceled at the last minute with excuses about headaches and exhaustion. She attended the necessary events, smiled for the cameras, played the role of Mrs. Blackwood when the Empire required it. But the moment they returned home, the mask dropped and the ice returned. He started staying later at the office, taking business trips that stretched longer than necessary. Anything to avoid the cold silence of their penthouse where every room felt like a crime scene marking the death of something that couldn't be resurrected. "Talk to me," he demanded one morning, cornering her in the kitchen before she could escape to her office. "Yell at me. Throw something. Do anything but this frozen-out bullshit." She met his eyes, and what he saw there made him step back. "You want me to react? You want emotion? You traded those privileges when you spent $40 million building a nursery for another woman's child. Now you have what you chose. The empire, the power, the Blackwood name. Congratulations. I chose you. You chose survival." Her voice could have flash-frozen blood. "You chose greed over your own son. You chose reputation over truth. Don't confuse that with choosing me." She brushed past him, shoulder checking his chest, the first physical contact they'd had in weeks that wasn't for public consumption. He stood in the empty kitchen, surrounded by marble and luxury and all the trappings of power, and felt the walls closing in. This penthouse that had once been a kingdom now felt like a gilded cage. She'd given him everything he'd asked for, the marriage, the empire, the appearance of victory. But somewhere between getting what he wanted and realizing what he'd lost, he'd stopped being a king and become a prisoner. His wife, his partner, his queen. She'd transformed into his warden. And the sentence she'd handed down was life. Every day spent living with a woman who looked at him like he was already dead. He'd thought choosing her meant keeping his power. He was only beginning to understand that she'd always been the power, and he'd just sentenced himself to watch her wield it while he slowly disappeared. Subscribe if you know exactly where this is heading, and trust us, it gets so much worse for him. 6 weeks after Harper Quinn disappeared into Portland with her blood money, she scheduled a meeting. Not with him, with the Syndicate Council. The 5 men who controlled Chicago's organized crime like puppet masters pulling strings on an empire built over generations. She'd grown up with these men, attended their daughters' weddings, stood at their father's funerals. They'd watched her marry the ambitious kid from the West Side and given their blessing because her father had asked them to, because Castellane blood made everything legitimate. She met them at the Drake Hotel, private room, no recordings, no witnesses. Old school. the way her father had taught her real business was conducted. Gerald Graves sat at the head of the table, white-haired and sharp-eyed, her father's oldest friend. This better be important. You don't call a full council meeting for marriage counseling. She placed a leather portfolio on the table, slid it to the center. Open it. Inside, bank statements showing unauthorized fund transfers. Photographs of the Lincoln Park townhouse purchased with Drake acquisition money meant for territorial expansion. Copies of contracts he'd signed without council approval. Side deals that violated territory agreements. Shipments that bypassed the usual distribution networks. Evidence of a man building his own empire within the empire. Taking what wasn't his. Operating like he'd already inherited her father's throne instead of just borrowing the seat. He's been running unauthorized operations for 18 months, she said, her voice steady as she listed his crimes. The Drake money was supposed to secure waterfront territory. Instead, he bought a house for his mistress. The Montenegro accounts were meant for expansion. He's been siphoning funds into private holdings. He's making moves without council consent, gentlemen. Acting like he owns what my father built. Graves studied the documents, his expression darkening with every page. The other council members leaned in, reading over his shoulder. She watched their faces shift from skepticism to recognition to the kind of cold fury that got people disappeared. "Where's the girl now?" one of them asked. "Portland. Paid off. Pregnant with his child." She let that sink in. A child that could become a liability. A woman who knows too much about operations. A security risk he created because he couldn't keep his priorities straight. "And you're bringing this to us instead of handling it internally because—" Graves' eyes narrowed. "Because this isn't about a failed marriage." She leaned forward, palms flat on the table. "This is about a man who forgot that the Blackwood name isn't his. It's mine. My father gave him territory, gave him legitimacy, gave him a seat at this table through me. And he repaid that gift by treating the empire like his personal bank account." The room fell silent. She could see them calculating, weighing loyalties, remembering that the Castellane name had been there long before the Blackwood reputation existed. "What do you want?" Graves asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Full operational control. He keeps the title, the public face. But every decision runs through me. Every contract needs my signature. Every territory move requires my approval." She pulled out another document. "I've already drafted the restructuring papers. You just need to vote." "You're asking us to neuter him," another council member said, "to make him a figurehead in his own organization. I'm asking you to save this organization from a man who's proven he'll sacrifice everything. Security, loyalty, legacy. For a mistress and a midlife crisis." Her eyes swept the table. "My father built relationships with you for 30 years. What has he built besides debt and liability?" Graves sat back, fingers steepled. "If we do this, there's no going back. You understand that? You're declaring war on your own husband." She smiled, cold, certain. "I declared war 6 weeks ago. This is just me winning it." The vote took 4 minutes. Unanimous. What do you think happens when he finds out she just took everything? Comment below. Graves delivered the news himself. Walked into his office on a Tuesday morning with the restructuring papers and a whiskey that tasted like defeat. "The council voted unanimously," Graves said, setting the document on his desk. "Effective immediately. All operational decisions require her signature. All financial transfers need her approval. All territory negotiations go through her office first. You remain CEO in title, but the power? That's hers now." He'd read the papers 3 times before the words stopped blurring. Looked for loopholes that didn't exist. Searched for escape clauses his wife had been too smart to leave. "She went to the council?" His voice came out hollow. "My own wife went behind my back to the syndicate?" "Your wife reminded the council whose daughter she is." Graves stood to leave, paused at the door. Your mistake wasn't the affair. It was forgetting that the Castellane name was here long before you arrived, and it'll be here long after you're gone. She just made sure you understand that now. The door closed. He sat in the silence of an office that suddenly felt like a museum exhibit. Everything still bore his name. The letterhead, the door plaque, the contracts stacked on his desk waiting for a signature that no longer mattered. Within a week, reality set in. Every call he made got redirected to her office. Every meeting he scheduled required her presence. Every decision he'd once made unilaterally now waited in her inbox for approval she granted or denied with surgical precision. She attended the meetings, sat at his right hand like she always had. But when the families looked for direction, their eyes slid past him and landed on her. When questions arose about territory or finance or strategy, they addressed her first. He'd become decoration, a tattooed mascot for an empire that was always hers by blood and now officially hers by vote. He watched her thrive in the role she'd been preparing for since childhood. Watched her negotiate deals with a ruthlessness that made veteran syndicate bosses nod with respect. Watched her consolidate power with the kind of strategic brilliance he'd never possessed, had only borrowed through proximity to her name. The worst part wasn't the lost power. It was watching her bloom in his absence. She'd been holding back, he realized now, playing support when she could have been leading all along. He'd been king of a castle built on her father's foundation, and she'd been the architect letting him think he'd designed it. He tried once to push back, signed a contract without her approval, a shipment deal that should have been routine. She'd walked into his office, placed the contract on his desk, and set it on fire. Watched it burn in his marble ashtray without saying a word. The message was clear. Test me again and it won't be paper that burns. At night, he lay in their bed, separate rooms now. She'd moved into the master suite and left him the guest bedroom, and thought about Harper Quinn. Wondered if she'd had the baby yet. If his son was born. If the child would grow up knowing his father chose power over presence. Chose empire over love. Chose wrong. He'd gotten exactly what he'd picked. The throne, the title, the appearance of control. And it was the loneliest, most hollow victory he'd ever experienced. She'd given him a choice and he'd chosen survival. What he hadn't understood was that survival without power, without respect, without the woman who'd actually built everything he'd claimed as his own, that wasn't survival at all. That was just a very slow death with excellent real estate. Some nights, when the penthouse felt too big and too empty and too much like a monument to his own stupidity, he'd pull up old photos on his phone. Her laughing at their wedding. Him kissing her forehead at a charity gala. The two of them building something he'd convinced himself was his to risk. He traded it all. The partnership. The love. The future. For what? A few months with a younger woman who'd taken the money and run. For a child he'd never meet. For the brief, stupid fantasy that he could have everything without consequence. His wife had taught him the oldest lesson in their world. There's always a consequence. And she'd made sure his would last the rest of his life. If you believe betrayal should have consequences, hit subscribe. Cheaters and liars won't. Comment loyalty matters if you stand with her, not him. The war was over. She'd won so completely that he hadn't even realized he was losing until the crown was already gone from his head and resting on hers, where it had always belonged.